Hi everybody, I hope you're doing well today. In this video, we're going to start our crash course on logic, and we're going to do this by talking about what an argument is, how to identify premises and conclusions in an argument, and then I'll say a couple things just about the different ways that we can try to learn from using arguments. So let's just start out by thinking about, well, what exactly is an argument? So I want you to think about what first comes to your mind when you hear the word argument. Maybe you start to think about things like disagreement, controversy, certain topics like politics, religion, morality, maybe debate, maybe winners and losers, maybe even yelling or shouting, or anger, something unpleasant. So maybe that picture that I showed in the last slide really captures a lot of the ideas that come to mind metaphorically with the idea of an argument. But there's some other ideas that might come to mind as well, things like evidence, proof, beliefs, reasons or reasoning, maybe support, a thesis. So now that you've been able to reflect a little bit on what you think about when you hear the word argument, let's maybe compare that to what you might find when you Google the word argument. When I did that, this is the definition that I found. Notice there's two different definitions given here. The first one says an argument is an exchange of diverging or opposite views, typically a heated or angry one. So that definition matches that first sort of idea of maybe shouting or yelling, anger, something unpleasant, people combating with one another, winners and losers. But then notice the second definition. Talks about an argument as a reason or set of reasons given with the aim of persuading others that an action or idea is right or wrong. Now that definition seems to go much better with those other ideas that you associate with argument, things like evidence or belief or reasons or reasoning. And this second definition is much closer to the way that we're going to be using argument in this class and the way that it's actually used in most academic subjects. So an argument is just a series of statements, some of which supposedly provide support for one of the others. Now, there's two parts to this definition. The first part is just that an argument is a series of statements. What exactly is a statement? Now, for our purposes, we can just think about a statement as any sentence that's capable of being either true or false. So let's consider some examples. My name is Sam. The Eiffel Tower is located in Japan. 2 plus 2 equals 4. 10 is a prime number. The number of dinosaurs that have lived on Earth is an even number. Intelligent alien life currently exists within our universe. Every single one of these is a statement because every one of these is capable of being either true or false. Now, of course, there are some differences between each of these statements. Some of them are true. My name really is Sam. Some of them are false. The Eiffel Tower is not located in Japan. Some of them are necessarily true, like 2 plus 2 equals 4. That has to be true. It couldn't be false. 10 as a prime number is necessarily false. It couldn't be true. Another difference is some of these statements I know to be true or I know to be false, but the last two, I just don't know either way. I don't know if it's true that aliens exist. I don't know if that's false. Nonetheless, I still know that the sentence has to be one or the other. It's either true or false, even if I don't know which one, and that's enough to make it a statement. So from this first part of our definition of an argument as a series of statements, there's a couple important takeaways you can consider. Firstly, any sentences that don't qualify as statements cannot actually be a part of an argument. For example, questions can't be part of arguments, and commands can't be part of arguments. And this is because neither of these are true or false. Questions and commands don't make claims about how the world is. A question is a request for information. A command is an attempt to get someone to do something. So when I ask my wife, hey, do we have any milk at home? It doesn't make any sense to say that that's true or false. I'm not making a statement. When I call my wife at the grocery store and I say, pick up some milk while you're there, that can't be true or false because I'm not making a claim about the world. And so it doesn't qualify as a statement and can't be part of an argument. Moreover, since an argument has to be a series of statements, this means expressing a single statement or belief you have doesn't qualify as giving or engaging in argument. And that's true even if there's another person who disagrees and expresses some contradictory statement or belief. So let's consider an example. Imagine someone says, Well, God created our universe. Well, they haven't given an argument yet. Even if, imagine another person says, no, there's no creator and there is no God. So in this scenario, what we have is two people disagreeing or contradicting one another. We don't have anybody engaging in an argument yet because nobody has attempted to give a series of statements supporting their claim. So this brings us to the other part of the definition of an argument. These statements have to supposedly provide support for one of the other statements. So there's an important takeaway here. Not just any series of statements is going to make an argument. As an example, consider the following statements. Dr. Taylor has a red desk in his office at home. Dr. Taylor has 3 children, and Dr. Taylor loves to play board games. So notice we have a series of statements. We don't have just one. And interestingly, all the statements are related to one another as well. They're all about the same topic, me, Dr. Taylor. But there's no argument given here because none of these statements are attempting to support any of the others. But let's compare a different series of statements. Imagine I say that Dr. Taylor must love to play board games. He owns more than 100 board games, and collecting 100 board games costs a good chunk of money and takes up quite a bit of storage space. Here, we do have an argument because these statements are related to each other in a very specific way. So we have these first two statements. Dr. Taylor owns more than 100 board games, and this other statement that collecting 100 board games costs a good chunk of money and takes up quite a bit of storage space. These two statements are meant to lead to or support this idea that Dr. Taylor must love to play board games. So notice we have two kinds of statements here. We have two statements that are attempting to provide support, and we have another statement that is supposedly receiving the support that the other ones are trying to convince you of. So this corresponds to two kinds of statements we see in arguments. First, we have the premises of an argument from which we infer some conclusion. So the premises are what are attempting to provide the support, and the conclusion, it is what supposedly is receiving support from the argument. It's what the argument is trying to convince you of. So let's revisit this idea that not just any series of statements makes an argument. Some series of statements don't make an argument because they lack any inference from premises to a conclusion. Instead, some series are just going to give you a report of information. Some series might try to give you a warning. Some might try to give you advice. Some might try to offer an explanation. So when you read a passage, you shouldn't just assume that there's an argument being made. You need to check whether or not any of these statements are attempting to provide support, whether there's any inference from premises to conclusion expressed by that passage. So let's consider some examples. Here's a passage that I've taken from an online article. You can pause the video and read it through real quick. But I want you to determine, do you think this passage counts as an argument? So this passage does not count as an argument. This here is just reporting various facts about what people said in response to a survey. Now there's this idea in this passage that rich nations ought to take on more of the responsibility for addressing climate change, but there's no attempt to give evidence to support this claim. Let's consider another passage that I found online. Pause the video, read it through, and decide, does this passage count as an argument? The answer here is yes. This passage is attempting to convince us of a specific conclusion by providing supporting statements or evidence that we are meant to thereby infer its conclusion from. But of course, once you determine that a passage has an argument, well, you should go on to try to identify which statements serve as the premises and which serve as the conclusion. So how can you do that? Well, one thing you can do is you can look for premise and conclusion indicators. Let's consider a few examples of premise indicators. Since, because, given that, firstly, secondly, as indicated or shown by, evidenced by, due to, owing to, assuming that. These are all often, not always, but often used to introduce premises. So what about examples of conclusion indicators? Here you can look for therefore, thus, hence, consequently, so, as a result, shows that, follows that, This suggests, proves, or demonstrates that. This entails or implies that. These are phrases that are often used to introduce a conclusion. So you can use them as clues to try and to identify where the premises are, where the conclusion is in a particular passage. So let's consider this passage again. What premise or conclusion indicators do you notice? The one that I noticed right away is right after the comma in the first sentence. It says, as evidenced by. So what comes after that is the evidence or premises that are meant to support the earlier claim. So I know that everything after the evidenced by are the premises, and everything before the pandemic is far from over, that's the conclusion. So it's trying to convince you that the pandemic is far from over by then offering this evidence to support that conclusion. So when you're engaging with a piece of philosophy throughout this course, or honestly, whenever you're really reading anything or listening to anything, you should consider the following. Firstly, is the argument or presentation giving an argument, or is it doing something else? If it is an argument, what are the explicit and implicit premises? And if it's an argument, what is the explicit or implicit conclusion? Notice that here I talk about both explicit and implicit premises and conclusions. That's because sometimes when you read a passage, or sometimes when someone's giving a presentation, they might be relying on premises that they're leaving as assumptions. They're not stating out loud, or they're not writing down. They assume that the reader will recognize that they're relying on those ideas, or they assume that the conclusion is so obvious from the evidence that they've given, they don't actually state it, they just leave it to the audience to draw that conclusion. But you should make sure that you understand what that is, even if it is left implicit by the author or speaker. So our focus in this video is really on trying to understand what an argument is and how to reconstruct them and understand the arguments that other people have given. But once we've reconstructed someone else's argument, or we've given our own, we can then start trying to evaluate the argument. At that point, we can then decide, well, is this really a good argument or a bad argument? In what ways is it good? In what ways is it bad, for instance? So even though this video is mainly about what arguments are and how to identify and reconstruct them, I do want to give you just a little bit of advice about what kind of mindset you ought to adopt when you start trying to engage with those arguments. So if you look at the pictures here, they represent two kinds of mindsets you might try to adopt when engaging in an argument. On the first mindset, you approach arguments as a weapon, something you can wield against your opponents to dominate their thinking. But on another way of thinking about arguments, we can think about them not as weapons, but as tools, as helpful tools for inspecting or reflecting on our thinking and others' thinking. And I want to suggest that oftentimes it's much better to approach arguments and engage in an argument with this mindset that thinks of them as a tool as opposed to a weapon. So when we think of arguments as tools, they can help us better understand why someone else believes what they do. Or we can learn how to clarify why we believe what we do, so that we can better explain it to others. Or maybe we can better understand our own beliefs. We can also maybe invite others and ourselves to reflect on evidence or reasons that they or we may have missed, and thereby provide additional information. So the idea is, when I give arguments, when I say, here's my premises for my conclusion, maybe in giving those premises, the person I'm talking to didn't realize that some of those things were true. And so when they hear my argument from this opposing side, they get information they didn't have before. Similarly, when I listen to other people's arguments and I try to engage with them and discover what their premises or evidence are, I might discover that there's certain evidence or certain ideas that I just didn't know about and I missed. And now that I know about them, it might change my mind about the things I believe. Another thing it can do is arguments can help us to illustrate gaps in others' thinking. When we listen to their arguments, when we listen to their reasoning, we might thereby notice where the flaw is, where the gap is. Maybe the premises they believe are true, but we notice that there's a gap between their premises and conclusion that maybe the other person didn't notice. And so by considering their argument, we can thereby pinpoint where their mistake is. But similarly, we should be open to the possibility that sometimes we have gaps in our own thinking. And so by giving our arguments, we thereby open an opportunity for others to display to us where we may have those gaps. Moreover, by thinking of arguments as tools, it helps us understand that when we criticize an argument, or when someone criticizes our argument, that's very different than criticizing the person. Very good people can maybe sometimes have bad arguments. When we criticize that argument, we're not saying that they are a bad person. We're just saying that their argument fails to support the conclusion that they give. Of course, bad people can also give bad arguments. Bad people can also give good arguments. So praising an argument also isn't praising the person that gives it. When we engage with arguments, I want to suggest that we ought to practice a kind of intellectual humility when considering our own and others' arguments. So every human being is fallible, including ourselves. Other people make mistakes, but we also know that we make mistakes. And so when we disagree with others, sometimes they've made a mistake, but sometimes we've unknowingly made a mistake. And so if we're the ones that have made mistakes sometimes, well, by considering other people's arguments with an open mind, that increases the chances that we'd be able to discover and correct the mistakes that we've made. But on the other hand, well, sometimes it isn't us who's made a mistake. Sometimes it's other people who have the wrong belief. But even if our conclusion is true, sometimes there can be gaps in our reasoning that led us to that conclusion. And so even if, when we disagree with someone else, even if we're in the right, even if we have the true conclusion, by considering other people's arguments that disagree with us, we can learn to better understand what their position is and why they hold it. But we can also learn maybe where some of the potential holes are in our argument so we can learn to strengthen the reason we have for that true belief. And so notice, this means that when we engage with arguments from those people who disagree with us, and we do so in a way that is open-minded, it provides us an opportunity to learn something regardless of whether our belief is right or wrong. So no matter what, we're in a position to learn something and get something out of engaging in those arguments. So what have you learned in this video? You've learned what an argument is in this formal sense that we're going to be using in this course. You've learned the difference between premises and conclusions. You've learned some tips for how to identify an argument, how to identify its premises, how to identify its conclusions. And I've given you a couple tips for how to approach an argument with a learning mindset. So that's all for this video. In the next video, we'll start talking about how to actually evaluate arguments as either good or bad. I'll see you then.